Welcome, everyone. We have our first forum, and we have a very special guest and a very special panel today. Today's guest, we have Fadhel Kaboub. Oh, shoot, the thing is echoing. I don't know. Is this me? Jesus. Dr. Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Denton University and the president of the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity. He's held research affiliations with the Levi Economics Institute and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is an expert on modern monetary theory, known as MMT, the Green New Deal, and the Job Guarantee. His work focuses on policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global South, build resilience, and promote. So, Dr. Kaboub, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure joining you guys.
Yeah. Just before we start, we're just going to go around the panel just to ask, how everyone got into this field, where to the global South or MMT, and then Dr. Kaboub is going to talk about, the stuff that he came here today to talk about. So, Nick, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I could start. Pretty much what got me into MMT, I think it was in like November. I got a copy of The Deficit Myth, and then from there, Stephanie Kelton, she mentioned the Job Guarantee. And I've always been pretty much interested in like a good social programs and wealth and programs to help like eliminate poverty. And through MMT and just like talking to people like Wes, who helped me and Hasib helped me learn a lot more about MMT. I got really interested, and I've just done a bunch of research on the Job Guarantee, which is a tremendous program. And that's pretty much how I got into MMT myself.
Hi, my name is Tanish. I'm a junior in high school, and I really got into MMT about around, I would say, mid March of last year. But I really got into post-Keynesian economics back in January of last year when I got my first copy of General. And my main research through MMT has been through the areas of inflation. I love learning about inflation. I love learning how MMT looks at inflation and how the theory of inflation works. One of the main reasons that I picked up MMT was because obviously I saw Bernie Sanders' campaign back in 2020. I looked at like his campaign team, and I saw some people like Mrs. Kelton, and I read Wikipedia'd them and saw a lot about it and a lot of it about MMT. So I became really interested in learning about the branch of economics, which brought me to post-Keynesian and then MMT.
I'm Gannon. I got into MMT through watching Randall Wray's lectures, and then from there reading papers on the Levy Institute. I'm excited to learn more today. I wouldn't call myself an expert by any means, so I'm pretty excited to talk with everyone here.
My name is Vanessa. I've been interested in politics for a really long time. I definitely got into it through Bernie Sanders in 2016. But what made me research more about MMT was trying to find ways to, specifically the global South, because my family's from Ecuador and they've had problems with economic sovereignty my entire life. So hearing those discussions about politics in that country definitely made me research more options for the country.
My name's Jasper. I'm a senior in high school. I got into MMT through more just kind of like family discussion. I think the 2009 financial crisis was a big field of interest for me, and I want to go into finance. So, as I was learning about that, I learned about how, maybe the government's spending abilities is further than what we believed.
Hasib?
Yeah, hi, my name is Hasib. I'm also a senior in high school. And I really got into MMT because I got into MMT through post-Keynesian economics, which I drew a huge interest in following, which I got an interest in from Bernie Sanders' campaign and being a social democrat and vouching for policies such as Medicare for all. I realized I couldn't really do any of this with like a strong economic backing to the proposals I was giving, which led me to looking into post-Keynesian economics, the works of Keynes, Kaldor, Kalecki, and then how a lot of these works have also translated into MMT, such as the theories of endogenous money, deficit spending, full employment, which is pretty much how I got into it.
My name is Wes. I'm a freshman in college. I'm getting my PhD in economics. I'd say the big thing that got me into MMT was Hyman Minsky. I've read, what was it? It was one of Hyman Minsky's books, and I think that's probably what launched me into learning about MMT.
Awesome stuff. So yeah, I'm sure you have big surprises for us today. So take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, guys, for hosting me today, and I'm so excited to learn more about your interests and during the Q&A during the Q&A session. But I thought what I should do for today is start with some opening remarks. I was preparing some opening remarks last night, kind of to keep it short and hit the main points. And then as I started writing some of these bullet points, I noticed that a couple of lines were rhyming. So I just kept playing with it, and I ended up writing a poem. So I'm going to share this poem with you today. And it's work in progress. But hey, it's fun. And I think it's going to hit some of the major points about the Green New Deal, MMT, inflation, democracy, and the Global South, the issues of economic and monetary sovereignty. So I thought let's start with something fun and then just do Q&A. And then during the Q&A, I might share some slides with you just to show you some data if needed. If not, I think it's easier to do this in a conversational way. So this is work in progress. I'm going to read it for the first time publicly here. I may still play around with it over the weekend and edit it a little bit. But I decided to call it Longing for Genuine Global Solidarity. So here we go. You know that Green New Deal by Ed Markey and AOC? It needs to be a global GND. Just read the document from the IPCC. It's gloomy as hell, but that's a painful reality. Our plan must be global, with reparations for the tragedy of ecological damage and colonial atrocity. Millions of people want to live freely, with justice for all, peace and prosperity. They want dignity and hope, not your charity. Clean water, clean air, clean soil, that's not a fantasy. No more hunger and bread riots. We'll have food sovereignty. No more darkness nor smog. We'll have clean energy sovereignty. We'll use the sun, the wind, the tides, and even some volcanic energy. We'll end the pain, we'll end the suffering. We'll build a truly circular economy. We'll change the metric to guide every public policy. We'll use GPI, laser focused on quality of life, not some useless GDP. It won't be easy, cheap, or enemy-free. The naysayers will scream, the deficit, the debt. Oh my God, it's inflationary. Little do they know, we have plenty of productive capacity. We'll build even more with our industrial strategy. We'll go after price setters, cartels, and every monopoly. We'll set up Pecora-style hearings in every congressional committee. We'll fight corruption and greed and end the oligarchy. We will have a brand new Congress in Washington, D.C., 535 lawmakers, and a true participatory democracy. A government of the people, by the people, for the people, like it was supposed to be. We'll tax polluters, speculators, and the oligarchs. You see, not because we need their money or their permission to have an equitable society, but because we need to decarbonize the system and fight inequality. It's the only way forward. I can't compromise and settle for insanity. Don't try to distract my people with your conspiracy theories, QAnon, Rothschilds, gold bugs, and a new kind of cryptocurrency. Let's stick to the fact, history, logic, and a simple accounting identity. It's all brought into sharp focus under the lens of modern monetary theory. I know it's a little silly, but I like it. I made this poem rhyme with MMT. It's a paradigm shift. It's undeniable, don't you agree? It changes the narrative and it destroys the foundations of austerity. A whole new world is possible without artificial scarcity. We'll fight unemployment and poverty with a job guarantee. With decent wages, full benefits, and every need covered if necessary, we'll make those jobs green, community-driven, and focus on the care economy. We'll look after the planet, the children, and the elderly, every living thing. Every drop of water, every inch of soil is our responsibility. Every source of life is so precious, a gift in our custody, not some kind of private property. I'm taking this global climate action plan very seriously because I don't want to end up a climate refugee. Call your reps and tell them about Ayanna Pressley. She wrote the job guarantee resolution to complete the civil rights legacy. Urge them to endorse it promptly. Be sure to warn them. Ignore us and you will see. Your term in office will expire in January 2023. Hit the streets and chant with me. By the ballot or by decree, we demand a job guarantee. Humanity is longing for genuine global solidarity. So join me in this struggle. It's my final plea. I'll die trying if I have to, for this better future is within reach and it's yearning to be set free. Thank you.
That is
it.
Impressive.
I mean, I don't think I could rhyme that many words with MMT.
Why?
You did the impossible for
Well, there you go. So that's my poem, and I'm sticking with it.
Very nice.
And I think it does summarize quite a bit of what I wanted to say. So now it's open to Q&A.
Awesome. So just to let you know, everyone know how it works, we will basically start with just questions from the panel. If we find any questions in the chat that are not hostile, obviously Austrians, we will, there's echo on the thing, but we will, we'll just highlight them on the screen like this. Just make sure that, is that, yeah. Fadhel, you gotta make sure that there's no echo, just to make sure like the video's not playing. But if anyone has any questions, please ask in the chat.
I guess I could.
We'll have Nick go first. Yeah,
I could do the first basic one. How do you think an understanding of MMT could be useful for countries in the global south?
Very good question. So is there any echo? I turned off the Bluetooth. Is this
you're good?
Better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So MMT in the global south. So it's a very simple concept here. MMT is saying our traditional understanding of how much the government can spend is flawed, because the traditional understanding from economics textbooks tells us that government spending is limited by how much you can collect in tax revenues and by how much you can borrow from the private sector. That's it. Beyond that, the government is incapable of addressing, all the major issues. MMT is saying our spending capacity is actually much, much larger than that. It's not unlimited, it's constrained, and it's constrained by the risk of inflation. So MMTers are obsessed with the risk of inflation, as Tanish will tell you probably. So what determines the risk of inflation from an MMT perspective? It's two things, and I'll refer to them in the poem. One is a shortage of productive capacity. When we run out of skilled people and machinery and equipment, we can actually cause inflation if we continue spending, because you have more demand for those things, but not enough productive capacity to actually produce them. So the price goes up. That's an easy thing to deal with. It means we can actually create millions of jobs building more productive capacity, training people, building machinery and equipment, and so on. That's the easy part. The second source of inflation, which really constrains both countries like the US, but also developing countries, is abusive market power. That is, inflation can happen when key corporations can raise prices simply because they can, and because we let them, because we don't tax and regulate them accordingly. Think of big pharma, big tech, big oil. They have abusive price-setting behavior. So those are the sources of inflation. And that abusive price-setting system that we have, it's not going to go away by not spending more. It only goes away if we tax and regulate their market power out of existence by democratizing the market. So in the global south, these are also the two sources of inflation. Shortage of productive capacity is really critical, especially for small developing countries, especially when they have to rely on food imports and energy imports and medical imports, like the basic necessities. So those are the areas where we need to build more resilience for developing countries. So you can use something like a public employment program, a job guarantee, an industrial policy to strategically invest in those key pillars of the economy, food and energy to begin with, and then you start building from there. The problem is that most of the policies that have been implemented since the 70s and 80s have almost intentionally, systematically destroyed that resilience that we wanted to build by making those countries even more dependent on food imports, energy imports, medical imports. And the industrialization policies that they pursued were reinforcing those traps. I'll give you one example, and I think everybody will get this. So, number one, developing countries were told, you have beautiful, cities and historical sites and beaches and great weather. You should have a lot of tourists come visit and bring dollars to help your economy. So then you bring millions of tourists every year. You have to build the hotels. You have to heat and cool those hotels. You have to transport them. So you end up importing even more energy to support the tourism industry. And of course, millions of tourists means you have to import all the food to feed them too. So those are strategies that end up keeping you in that trap of lack of food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. Number two, and this is a critical example here for all developing countries were told you need to industrialize and modernize and build manufacturing capabilities and export your way out of poverty, right? You export more to the global north and so on. Well, it sounds great, except that if you end up being the assembly line with cheap labor and low environmental standards, the assembly line for the rest of the world, you end up with what we call low value added content of exports. So you have to import the machinery, the equipment, the high tech, all the inputs, and then just use cheap labor with lower labor standards and environmental standards to export just whatever you assembled. So that's a systematic trap that most developing countries have been stuck into. So exports for its own sake, industrialization for its own sake, has been a trap. So what I've been suggesting for developing countries is be strategic in your choices. Not every industry is a good industry. Not every job creation program is a good job creation program in the long term. Focus on resilience, on food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and build from within.
Thank you for answering the question. Steve actually has a question next. If you don't mind.
Yeah, so building off of that, going to more like policy prescriptions. I know that Bill Mitchell has written about this, and I know that a lot of post-Keynesians take this position as well. Would you say that it would be better for these countries to adopt, move more away from free trade and adopt more of a protectionist policy, such as imposing selective import controls and stuff, in order to sort of, prioritize production in their own economy? Because, as you said, they're importing such high-tech equipment and exporting such low-value goods, and there's the value of the labor in their own industries is also very low. So do you think protectionist policy and selective import controls are feasible and or desirable in this case?
Very good question, and you touched on so many important items here, and it's not really a yes or no question. The issue of protectionism is tricky because the earlier days of industrialization were days of protectionism. Soon after independence, most developing countries, followed the so-called import substitution industrialization. So they started to substitute items that they used to import and start manufacturing them domestically. And they call this the infant industry. So when you have an infant industry, you want to protect it from foreign competition through tariffs and other trade barriers. And that was totally acceptable in the 50s and 60s. At the time, a lot of countries pursued that. The problem with that protectionism is that it comes in different kinds. There's a protectionism that says, we're going to protect this infant industry for the first 10, 15 years, whatever time period, But then we're going to make sure that during that period of protection, we're going to strengthen the industry in terms of quality of output, in terms of capital investment, in terms of productivity, in terms of customer service, so that when you are no longer an infant, so to speak, you're actually strong enough to withstand global competition and be able to build from there. The problem is that in many developing countries, that period of protectionism was a period of essentially building an elite business class that was able to become essentially a monopoly in the domestic market and not really invest in improving capabilities or quality or customer service. So by the time we get to the period of global free trade in the 70s and 80s and 90s, those industries were essentially incapable of competing because they didn't have the resilience necessary. So protectionism, if it doesn't come with strings attached in terms of improving productivity and quality, it's a useless thing. It actually can be more dangerous because it builds an internal oligarchy with government protection and influence and power and politics and so on. So the solutions moving forward, I'll say a couple of words about free trade versus protectionism. So I talk about protectionism. Free trade, I mean, a lot of people say free trade is great because competition is good for you. It improves service to customers, it lowers prices, and it's a win-win for everybody. And then a lot of people use these metaphors referring to competition in sports as healthy and good and everything else. Well, yeah, but we don't allow a heavyweight boxing champion in the ring with a lightweight boxing champion. It's illegal, it's ugly, nobody wants to watch it. But somehow we allow this in international trade. We allow a heavyweight industrial country like the US or Japan to compete with a lightweight small developing country and destroy their economy, and we call it free trade and then we call it fair. Of course it's not. So many post-Keynesians and MMTers are much more in favor of strengthening competition and improving productivity and quality and so on, not through the model of free trade that we have now, but through a model of South-South trade, as in countries in the global South, maybe within the same region, with complementary resources and strategic choices for that sub-regional group to form small unions. The advantage of those small regional unions is the following. In order for any industry to really improve its efficiency and get to the level of economies of scale, which is where you actually lower the cost of your production, you have to have access to a large market, right? If your market is only 10 million consumers or 7 million consumers, industrialization can't really function there. You need access to 20, 30, 40, 200 million customers in order to produce a large enough volume and be able to lower your cost and so on. So with regional trade unions between equally competitive developing countries, you can have access to a large consumer base and you can build those industries. And you can start with strategic choices for food and renewable energy capabilities, some basic medical necessities, all of these things that are crucial to your resilience, you can build them through South-South trade strategies. I'll give you one example to close this, not from the global South, but from the global North. European countries didn't have a manufacturer that could actually compete on its own with Boeing, the US manufacturer. So Airbus was created not by a single European country, but by a joint venture by a number of European countries who put their resources together in a strategic and complementary way in order to create Airbus to be able to withstand competition with Boeing. There's no other way for Airbus to actually exist and be able to compete with Boeing. I'm not saying that developing countries need to create an aerospace industry tomorrow and compete with Boeing and Airbus, but you can start with the industries that matter strategically. Building renewable energy infrastructure, building transportation infrastructure, building basic public health equipment and needs that will be the foundation for economic development and prosperity. So the solutions do exist, but they do require one key element, which is something that I frequently repeat, which is the following. If you have no long-term vision for yourself as a country, then you are certainly going to be part of some other country's vision. You're part of their plan. Yeah, you're just a piece of the puzzle that they're going to place and, you know, incentivize you a little bit until you fall into the trap that they want, right? But if you have your own strategic vision, long term, no matter how small you are, and stay focused on achieving those goals, regardless of who's the prime minister and who's the president and who's in the parliament, because these are national security issues. These are not partisan issues in terms of food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and building resilience for your economy. The problem is that many developing countries, because of all the issues that you're probably familiar with, are so busy putting out fires left and right, constantly, to the point where they don't really have the time or energy or resources to think beyond a few weeks, a few months, maybe a couple of years. And it's always focused on the elections. It's always focused on who's in charge. And then add layers of corruption, add layers of all kinds of outside and internal interferences with this. And then you end up with no vision for the future. And that's the most dangerous thing we observe today around the world, is that countries don't really have this long-term vision that says, where do we see ourselves in the future? But the countries that do have long-term visions, like the US, like China, like Australia, they can plan accordingly and incentivize smaller countries in their satellite of influence to make them fit into that puzzle.
Thank you so much, Fadhel. And expanding on what you just said, like how these countries need to come together as one, right, in order to like build this economic prosperity. How do we stop the U.S. from intervening with that specifically? Because like historically, the U.S. has played a role in making the situations when they have these visions go south. How do we stop that from happening?
You know, it's not just the U.S. It's France, it's the UK, it's Italy, it's Australia, it's every other former colonial power. Why? Because those countries still perceive of the global South as part of their territory, you know, economic territory, for example. I'll give you an example which was really interesting that happened in the 90s, I guess, when Bill Clinton was president. Bill Clinton was going on a trip to Africa. And I think there was an initial group of countries that was announced, because these things are planned like months in advance. It's not like a surprise visit or anything. And usually the president, when they travel in these trips, it's like a business trip. They take with them a bunch of CEOs to sign contracts and deals and things like that. So there was a bunch of them on Air Force One with him. And then a week or so before the actual trip, they added a bunch of other countries to the trip. And all of those countries were Francophone countries that were perceived as, you know, former French colonies. This is the market for French companies, not for American companies. So Bill Clinton decided to fly through those countries and sign deals and you know, visit embassies and things like that. In a matter of days, the French president made a follow-up trip, visited all those countries to remind them that they still have those deals with French companies, that France has interest in those countries, and that this is not U.S. territory. I'm talking about the 1990s, not the 1790s, right? This is supposedly these are free countries, independent, but that's how much power and influence, you know, the global North has. And you hear it frequently. It's almost as if these are still colonies. So as long as the global South is divided, you know, countries like the US, like France, like the UK, and others will continue to take advantage, because you're in such a desperate economic situation, right? Even if you have peace, right? You have no internal conflicts, no armed rebellions, none of that, like a peaceful, developing country. You still have issues that you're dealing with: inflation, dependence on food imports, mass unemployment. All of these pressure points are so destabilizing, let alone if you have a military coup, let alone if you have an undemocratic system, let alone if you have neighboring countries, let alone if you have terrorism and trafficking across borders. All of those are massive problems for developing countries. So the US or France can just tip the balance a little bit by giving like one group a little bit of support, and they create massive problems for you. And if you decide, I want to build this long-term vision with the 5 neighboring countries, right? Which means we're going to import less from France or from Italy or from the UK because we're going to build this internal resilience. They don't have to, you know, the France or the UK or Italy, they don't have to go to every president and tell them, no, please don't do that. They just have to convince one of them, you know, we don't want you part of this deal, or else we'll do X, Y, Z, or else you lose these privileges, or else you'll no longer have access to foreign direct investment from our companies and so on. We'll create mass unemployment for you. We'll make your life miserable. And that's what it takes. One president says, you know what, we're out of this deal. We're not going to build this you know, joint transportation system or this joint energy sharing system or whatever. Then that's it. It's dead in the water, as they say. So these are serious issues. Or we're not saying this is all easy and we're going to be able to change the global south. But we're not even at the level of having a clear vision and conversation about what it looks like. Because once you have that clear vision and commitment, not just from presidents and prime ministers, but from the people, from social movements. And because social movements have been beaten up so badly that they lost track of the big picture. So we do have social movements fighting for labor rights in the global south, fighting for climate change policies, fighting for reparations, but they're, you know, broken up into smaller movements without a global solidarity system that says there's this one transformative platform of policies that we need to introduce all at once in a sort of big push, right? Not as charity, but as a demand, right? And that's why I've been thinking about and writing about this global Green New Deal framework with climate reparations, with colonial reparations, as this umbrella vision that gives everybody a unified platform to work with. I hope this answers your question a little bit ago.
Hello, Mr. Kaboub. My name's MJ. My question is, considering that global South tax systems, am I glitching, are incredibly corruptive, are there not risks when trying to implement MMT policies? Like looking at countries like, for example, like Algeria, right? I know my home country, our tax system is atrocious. So how would you be able to use taxation as a way to sort of control inflation in the way that MMT does?
Sure. Yeah, MMT doesn't really rely on taxation exclusively on to deal with inflation. If you go back to what I said earlier about the risks associated with inflation risk, one of them has to do with abusive pricing behavior. And that abusive pricing behavior by corporations, let's say private corporations, energy companies, telecom companies, whatever it is, who's supposed to regulate those abusive price setters in any economy? It's the government. It's politicians. It's people we elect. You know, refer to them as the 535 people we send to Washington, D.C. We call them lawmakers because they actually create the laws, including the tax system, including the regulatory system. So if those individuals are corrupt, then why would they bite the hands that feed them, right? If they're brought to you by the super PACs, by corporate interest, then they're not going to tax and regulate their market power. They're going to pretend that we have no spending capacity because inflation is going to destroy the economy. But what I'm suggesting, what MMT is suggesting, when we shine this bright light on the way the system works, which is what MMT does, we actually discover that the system is being suffocated by this abusive market power, by this shortage of productive capacity, which is also a source of power because they drive away the competition and they create artificial scarcity. And then they tell us we can't deliver all of these public goods for the rest of you because we've suffocated the spending capacity of the government. So I completely agree with you. In a corrupt political system, you're not going to be able to actually implement progressive policies. Progressive policies cannot be implemented by corrupt people. So when we say take money out of politics or get rid of money in politics, when progressive candidates say that, This is what we mean. It's not just about corruption, vaguely speaking. It's about suffocating the spending capacity of the government. It's not about the little millions of dollars here and there that they take to their Swiss bank accounts. That's important too. But it's really about suffocating the economy and denying public services to millions of people simply because they want to keep their abusive market power. And that's what the oligarchy is about. It's a small concentration of individuals and corrupt government officials to take advantage of the whole system.
I have a question real quick. So do you think, like, to start monetary sovereignty, do you think a nation like in the global south should like start its own currency, or should they use like another foreign backed currency like the United States dollar?
Very good question. And when Vanessa introduced herself, you mentioned that your family is originally from Ecuador. Ecuador is a classic example of a country that gave up its national currency at the time because of inflation and things like that. But it is what it is today. It's a country that became essentially a user of a foreign currency. So Ecuador is the equivalent of the state of Ohio or the state of New York in the US. In order for Ecuador to spend, it needs to tax its people in dollars in order to spend, or it can borrow from somebody, either domestically or internationally, US dollars in order to spend. Beyond that, Ecuador has no spending capacity, right? It's constrained and it's disciplined by the effort, by whatever the markets decide to lend to Ecuador. This is the same for the state of Ohio. We can either tax local residents here to pay for things or borrow from, municipal bond markets or whatever, up to a certain limit. It's not unlimited, but we're constrained. We're talking about monetary sovereignty of sovereign governments, like the federal government in the US, like the UK, like Australia, who can actually spend their own money into existence. And that spending capacity, spending money into existence, allows you that additional spending capacity. But that's not unlimited. As I said earlier, it's constrained by productive capacity of the economy and the market power, abusive market power that you allow in your economy to suffocate your economy. The more you tax and regulate it out of existence, the more spending capacity you create. So I'll be the last one to tell you that global South countries need to dollarize. That's like giving up, abdicating your monetary sovereignty and saying we're going to become a sub-territory of the US economy. We have no fiscal policy, no monetary policy of our own. Because when the US Federal Reserve Bank raises interest rates in the US, it affects what happens in Ecuador. Now, of course, when the Federal Reserve Bank Committee is sitting and debating whether they should lower interest rates or increase interest rates, do you think they're thinking about what's going to happen to the Ecuadorian economy? They could care less. They care about the US economy, right? So that's what we mean. You lose monetary sovereignty. You lose control over your economy. So for developing countries who still have their national currency, it doesn't mean they have full monetary sovereignty or a high degree of monetary sovereignty. What weakens their monetary sovereignty is the level of external debt that they owe to other entities. By external debt, I mean debt denominated in foreign currency. So, for example, and I can show you a quick picture here if you guys don't mind. I'm originally from Tunisia, so I'm going to show you what happened to Tunisia, and it's a classic example. So let's see if I can quickly share this screen here. Just one second. There you go. Can you guys see the screen here?
Yep.
So this is the trade balance for Tunisia. You notice it was pretty much balanced, a little bit negative here all the way until, the 1972 is when Tunisia decided to enter into these trade agreements and start doing export-led growth. Look at what happened with export-led growth. Tunisia became a net importer. Why? Because we had to import fuel to fuel industrialization. We had to import capital, and we specialized in low value-added content of manufacturing. So this negative trade balance, the flip side of it is external debt started to accelerate. So we started borrowing in US dollars and foreign currencies and Japanese yen and so on. And this debt that developing countries accumulate can't be paid by printing your own money. You have to actually earn those dollars somehow, right, in order to pay the debt. And that's really the trap that weakens your monetary sovereignty. So what are you told you should do? And this is starting in the 70s and 80s. You're told tourism will help you pay the debt. Well, I talked about it earlier. Tourism creates even more deficit because you have to import more energy, you have to import more food. You're told, try to export even more, even faster. You end up digging yourself into a deeper hole. You have to import more capital, more energy, and so on. You're told, all of these solutions end up being a trap. So you end up with massive amount of debt denominated in foreign currencies that you actually have to prioritize and pay. So now countries have to prioritize making debt payments to their lenders as opposed to investing in health or education or other important public services. So these are, for developing countries, the first thing you need to do to acquire a higher and higher degree of monetary sovereignty, you have to plug these basic holes in your economy, which is your food sovereignty, your energy sovereignty. That's why it's a no-brainer. When you're talking about food sovereignty, you invest in sustainable agriculture for your basic necessities. For energy sovereignty in this day and age, renewable energy is a no-brainer for climate purposes, obviously, but also for economic sovereignty purposes. And that's how you gradually liberate yourself from this external debt. Now, any debt you have that's denominated in your national currency, like the US, like Japan, it's always manageable. Japan has the largest debt to GDP country in the world, and yet it has no inflation. It's not going to go bankrupt because it's all in Japanese yen, and because Japan has this massive productive capacity to handle additional spending and so on. Japan doesn't actually have inflation. They're struggling with deflation for the last 30 years. They have negative interest rates. So all of these ideas that too much spending will automatically cause inflation is misplaced. It actually depends on how your economy is structured. So to answer your questions, for countries who have their actual national currency, focus on getting yourself out of this trap that I described here, and focus on building a stronger degree of monetary sovereignty via strategic policies that actually work in the long term. Because all the other strategies that the standard economics profession, public policy profession, World Bank, IMF have been telling developing countries have led to further problems deeper into that trap that I described today. And for countries that use a foreign currency, figure out a plan to transition to your own currency, because otherwise you're just a US territory or an Australian territory. You're going to depend on the help and charity and benevolence of other countries to support your economy during crises. And Ecuador is not the only country. Obviously, there are other countries, small Pacific islands and small island nations and things like that. But also Eurozone countries who opted voluntarily to give up their national currency and join the Eurozone system and kind of handed or abdicated their monetary sovereignty to the ECB, the European Central Bank, which is obsessed with, austerity policies. And when they face a crisis like they did in 2008, 2009, 2010, the ECB told them that's what you signed up for. We're not going to let you spend more. So cut spending, reduce pensions, privatize government agencies, figure it out. We're not going to help you. That's a problem, right? That's what happens when you give up your monetary sovereignty.
Thank you. So, in terms of monetary or economic sovereignty, I know Ecuador, after they dollarized, they attempted to kind of decrease their dependency on the IMF and the World Bank, but they instead started taking loans from China to kind of build infrastructure. So kind of how you mentioned earlier that countries in the global south become part of another country's long-term plan. So then how would a country like Ecuador or any other country in the global south kind of develop within itself and without relying on these foreign countries?
Very, very good question. So at any small developing country observing kind of the global balance of power, doing their homework, they'll figure out what makes the US tick, what makes China tick, because we know what their long-term vision is, more or less. I mean, a lot of it is public, a lot of it is clear from what they do. So you do your homework and you figure out what they really want, like in the long term. And you figure out which piece of the puzzle they've designed for you to fall into. And you can do that if you do your homework. And then you look at your own internal long-term national vision for where you want to be. And then you see which country has, a vision that is coherent, consistent, adjacent to where you see yourself. And you use your, geopolitical levers carefully to get what you want out of it, as opposed to saying, thank you very much, I'm going to fit into that piece of the puzzle you designed for me. For example, if you realize that energy sovereignty is a critical national security piece of the puzzle for you in the long term, you want to stop importing fossil fuels because it's a huge burden on your economy, and you also want clean energy and so on. So you figure out a long-term plan to build the renewable energy capacity domestically. Well, problem number one, you have no engineering capabilities, no manufacturing capabilities to do it. So the quick solution is to say, well, let's import it from China, right? And then for the rest of history, we're going to keep importing spare parts from China and relying on Chinese financing to expand our energy production, because it's not going to be a one-off. You always build more energy capacity. That's a bad solution. Solution number two, to say, well, there's a handful of countries that actually produce this technology. We're going to go around and shop and see who's interested. But we're not going to shop for buying the content. We're going to say, we need to build this. We're going to pick a technology, a particular set of technology. It could be German, it could be Chinese, it could be American or whatever. But we're not interested in shopping. We want to build productive capacity here. We want strategic partnership to train college graduates and vocational training programs to actually staff these factories and staff the installation and maintenance in the long term. And then you can say, we can build joint partnerships so that we develop the expertise and we build the capacity. And then we can become global South leaders, partners in other countries to replicate this model in other global South countries who are interested not in importing the technology and becoming users of it, but become partners and builders and developers in this. The US may not be interested in it. Germany may not be interested in it, but maybe China would be, because they want some level of influence in the region. They're willing to share market and expertise. If the Chinese are not interested, maybe the Scandinavian countries would be interesting. You will find partners, but you have to have the vision. You have to have a set of demands on your side. You don't go begging for help and saying, whatever you have, we'll take it. Right, and which is the problem that we have here. Diplomacy is an art, and there's plenty of levers within the diplomatic system that countries can use to get these things. But if you don't know what you want to get, then you end up with peanuts for no good reason, and you end up giving them exactly what they want. Right.
Yeah, so I think I'll go next. In my time of reading MMT, one of the initial issues that I saw brought up by others was that MMT's original models, that is, were largely based on America's domestic space, right? And obviously, using America in particular as an example is a little misleading, only because of obviously America's economic space is far greater than others. And this was solved by one of the more recent concepts that was proposed by the MMT school, which was the spectrum of sovereignty, right? That, certain countries have more power just based on the foreign demand for their currency, et cetera. So I was wondering, because just for curiosity, how would you respond to someone who said, well, the spectrum of sovereignty, although it is a good concept, that it is, even though these places would have greater domestic policy spaces, places like you could say Argentina or Zimbabwe because of their place on the spectrum, will never be able to deficit spend and to supply full employment or something like that. How would you respond to that?
Well, never say never, first of all. The second part, I want to give you a little bit of background. So when I first started in grad school at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, almost exactly 20 years ago now, one of my teachers was Randy Ray and Matt Forstater and Stephanie Kelton. They're all American economists, and they're all post-Keynesians who are working primarily on U.S. economic policy issues. And this was true for other post-Keynesians who, developed the MMT framework, Bill Mitchell in Australia, some other post-Keynesians in Canada and so on, or the UK. It makes sense. Their knowledge base, their expertise is based on the global north, the US economy. And for me, when I first learned these ideas, I was, very excited about the possibilities, and I was immediately asking the questions. How would this work for a small developing country with all of these constraints that we talked about today? External debt and trade deficit and lack of industrial productive capacity, all of these things. And, Randy Ray specifically said, yeah, this is an area that needs to be developed. We haven't put enough thought into it. But he did, from the very beginning, highlight the idea that we're talking about a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Maybe he didn't use that phrase, but he did articulate that those countries have initial problems that they have to resolve, which have to do with productive capacity, right? And, corruption and so many other issues. So it's not like the concern was invisible to MMTers from the beginning and it just emerged now. It's just we're talking about a handful of people who really developed this framework out of post-Keynesian economics and started focusing on the idea of monetary sovereignty. When you fast forward to today, you will find a handful of MMT economists and policymakers from the global south who are beginning to fine-tune and refine these ideas that I'm presenting to you today. So to specifically answer your question about Zimbabwe, about Argentina, about countries that are on the weakest end of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, MMT doesn't recommend that they should spend more. That is not the MMT recommendation. MMT shines the bright light on a country like Zimbabwe or Argentina and says, let's do a diagnosis first. What's causing your hyperinflation? What's causing the inflation problem in your country, the unemployment problem in your country? And very quickly you realize that it has to do with some of these issues. Zimbabwe, for example, the hyperinflation cycle that actually started there didn't start with government printing money left and right. It started with the government deciding to redistribute land from former colonial, white farmers to native African farmers. Sounds like a great idea, right? More justice, land redistribution, and so on. But it was done in a corrupt way. It was given to, the national security supporters and political supporters of President Mugabe at the time. And they happened to be not farmers, not even interested in farming. So you take the most productive source of your food security and you distribute it to people who are not interested in using it, don't even know how to use it to produce food. So what happened immediately? Food production dropped by 50%. So now you have food shortages. What happens in any market when you have the demand for food is still the same, but the supply dropped by 50%? Surprise, inflation. The price of those items is going to go up. So in response to the initial rise in prices, of course, inflation affects everybody, right? Now we're talking about food security. People need to buy food. Well, with the corrupt government system, who do you think the corrupt dictator would protect first? The military, the police, the elites. So in order to support the elite and allow them to afford the higher cost of living, the government started paying them more. So that's where the printing money comes in. But that became like throwing fuel on the fire, essentially, because you've just given a bunch of military officers and police officers a bunch of cash and sent them to the same market, a market that actually has a shortage of items. So you allowed them to bid up the prices even higher. And that was the first part of inflation. And because Zimbabwe is so close to South Africa and across the border, and South Africa didn't have food shortages, so now there's a huge opportunity for traffickers to cross the border, bring food items, sell them at a higher price in Zimbabwe. Well, in order to do that, you need to bribe the military and cross-border security officers and so on. So now you have armed gangs, essentially, controlling your food supply. And it's not just food, it's also fuel, it's also medicine, it's also clothing, everything. And that became the accelerator for hyperinflation. So what MMT is saying, the source of inflation is corruption, is abusive pricing behavior, it's shortage of productive capacity. It has nothing to do, the printing of the money is incidental, it just happens as part of the process. It's not the source. So whether you stop the printing or accelerate the printing, you're not eliminating the roots of the problem. So that's the kind of useful aspect of MMT, is that it tells you what the roots of the problem are. And when you highlight this to government officials in countries like this, they realize in order to win this battle, you actually have to go after corrupt military officials, border trafficking, border control officers. You're talking about an internal armed struggle against armed gangs and corrupt military officers who actually can fight you back. And which political party is going to do this? Which candidate is going to do this? These things can turn pretty ugly pretty quickly. So these are the kinds of challenges that you have to tackle before you advise any government, let's spend more and have a job guarantee and end poverty. You're not going to end poverty by spending more in Zimbabwe. You have to address the roots of the problem.
I don't mean to follow up here. I like, for what about if someone were to tell you that, like, let's say we had Argentina fix these, so they can impose obligations there, and they're able to take out the amount that they target that is needed to be taken out. And let's say they don't have these issues. I know we're kind of working in a fantasy land here, but let's say that they don't, like, hypothetically, we wash away these issues. How would you respond to someone saying that they're so low down on the spectrum of sovereignty that regardless of these issues, that they still wouldn't be able to finance a job guarantee program?
Very good question. So I'll work with you on a hypothetical case. Okay, let's say we have a small developing country on the weak end of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, with lots of external debt and food imports, energy imports, medical imports, the whole thing.
Thank you.
And we want to introduce some MMT-informed development policies to move that country to a higher level of economic sovereignty over time. So here's what I would do. You will definitely not start spending immediately. You start focusing on those strategic areas that I mentioned earlier. Let's say it's energy sovereignty and food sovereignty, to keep things simple, right? So let's say we want to build renewable energy capacity, and we're going to spend $500 million in the next 2 years to do that. And we're going to hire, 5,000 people, pay them decent wages to build the solar, panels and wind turbines and start moving in the right direction. So we're going to spend $500 million. Before we even start the spending, you have to do strategic planning, which is the following. You're going to look at those workers that you just hired, the 5,000 workers or whatever, and you say, we're paying them a decent wage. Let's say, $20,000 a year in the developing country, or whatever number. Come up with a number. And then say, what will those individuals do with this income? They're going to buy food, they're going to buy clothing, they're going to buy entertainment, transportation, you name it, the whole thing. And every country has existing statistics that tells us how consumers spend their income. For middle class, working class people, we know how much they spend on rent and food, transportation, entertainment, you know it. So now we know the second wave of spending that's going to come out of that, right? Because you're paying them with your local currency, you're paying them national currency wages. So the second wave of spending is the important one, because it's going to tell us how much additional demand for food is going to take place, how much additional demand for transportation, for housing, for clothing is going to take place from those individuals. And then you plan accordingly. do we have enough domestic productive capacity to produce that additional food or that additional entertainment or that additional transportation? And of course, you focus very carefully on the additional demand that will be imported from abroad, especially for food and energy. And if you realize there's this one weakness in the economy that's going to be further weakened by this additional spending because it's going to cause more food imports, for example, then you realize you're going to have much more pressure on your exchange rate because of the additional food imports, which means your currency will weaken because of that, which means your food imports will become more expensive. So you'll be importing food at a higher cost. You're going to have food riots because of that. And that's what causes food inflation, because the imported food is more expensive because of your weaker currency. So before you even start this whole thing, you realize, wait a minute, instead of spending $500 million on building renewable energy, let's do 400 million only and spend 100 million on building some food energy, some food sovereignty infrastructure by creating domestic sustainable agricultural policies that allow us to serve that additional demand for food. So that this way you've spent the total of 500 million, 400 on energy and 100 on food, and you've eliminated the additional pressure on your exchange rate. And of course, you have to do this across the board for everything that the country needs. So once you do that gradually, you don't have to start with billions of dollars and massive transformation of the economy. You can start gradually by shifting away subsidies that you currently offer to fossil fuel producers, subsidies that you offer to consumers so that they can afford the cheaper transportation and the cheaper imported food and so on, which is what most developing countries end up doing. Because of the inflation that they import, they end up subsidizing people, otherwise they'll have food riots. So you shift away those resources from subsidizing the expensive food that you import, the expensive fossil fuels that you import, to actually using those subsidies to building the domestic infrastructure locally. And once you do that in a cumulative way over a period of 10 years, you've built quite a bit of resilience and you've saved yourself quite a bit of external borrowing and you've created lots and lots of local jobs to actually help you build that. But you're doing it strategically. So you can create 5,000 jobs by allowing a foreign corporation to come outsource jobs from the US and build a low value added content manufacturing unit. That's 5,000 jobs. Or you can create the 5,000 jobs strategically by building more resilience in your economy. The quality of the jobs, the quality of contribution to the economy is like day and night between the two. And that's really what MMT is trying to highlight. Let's be strategic. Let's be selective. Let's be careful in the way we design public policy. What's been happening in the last 40 years is that we've given up national industrial strategies and policies. We've handed this to global corporations under the name of free trade. They decide where they want to go. They decide where they want to invest. They decide who they want to hire and how they build the global supply chain. You, the government, you're just going to give them lower taxes and lower wages and lower regulations, and don't worry, they'll come to you and create jobs. That's just messed up, right? This is not how sovereign governments should design their economy and protect their people.
Thank you.
I have a few questions. I was reading Mr. Ray about like some of the minimum wage stuff through an MMT, like I guess like government or something, and he was talking about like the minimum wage, and he brought up the ELR, right? And he pretty much said the ELR, if we do maximize full employment, it does act as price stability for the nation. And another thing I wanted to ask you, right? Would you have like the minimum wage for the private and public sector, or just for the public sector?
Very good question. So many MMTers and post-Keynesians, when we refer to the job guarantee program or the employer of last resort program, as you refer to it, ELR, we refer to it also as a buffer stock mechanism, as a price stability mechanism. And a buffer stock is a concept that we actually use in the US and many other countries all the time. And it's designed to stabilize prices of key commodities. And what MMTers are saying, we have these buffer stocks for corn and wheat and coffee in Brazil and all of these key commodities have a mechanism to stabilize their prices. And these are important price stability features. But we don't have a price stabilization mechanism for labor, for the most precious thing in the economy, right? We just allow the free market to determine the price of labor. Even though we have minimum wage laws, let's say, federal minimum wage is $7.25 or $8.25 or whatever it is in different countries, the effective minimum wage that an unemployed person receives is zero, right? That's the actual wage that you receive. But we don't allow the price of corn or wheat or coffee to drop to zero. We have mechanisms in place by the federal government whereby the federal government acts as a buyer of last resort when there's a massive surplus of wheat in the economy. So the government buys it and stores it away, and as a result keeps the price of wheat reasonably profitable for producers. And when there's a drought or some sort of crop failure in a few years, and there would be a shortage of wheat in the market, normally the price of wheat will skyrocket, and that would cause inflation, food inflation for consumers. That's where the government steps in as a seller of last resort to bring the price of wheat down to a reasonable level. So that's the buffer stock. It creates these boundaries for the price mechanism to fluctuate, not too expensive for consumers, not too low to force farmers into bankruptcy. We do that for wheat, for coffee, for cotton, for all kinds of things, but not for labor. So the MMT price stabilization feature says when the government steps in as a buyer of last resort of labor, the government stabilizes the price. And if we as a society say a decent living wage for a job guarantee program should be $15 an hour plus benefits, plus the right to unionize, plus XYZ, and I encourage all of you to check out the job guarantee resolution that Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley just introduced a couple of weeks ago, which includes all of these things, then that's going to be the standard. So yes, it is for job guarantee workers, those benefits, but now if I'm working at McDonald's or Walmart and I'm getting, a lower minimum wage and no benefits and miserable workplace conditions, why would I accept that? Now there's a community-based public service employment program that gives me better working conditions, opportunities to learn and grow, decent wages and benefits. It includes childcare, it includes healthcare. Why should I keep working for McDonald's? So that de facto forces the rest of the private sector to compete at that level. If they really wanted workers, they have to treat them with dignity. And we've done this before. When we transitioned from slavery to actually paying people for their work, what did those slave owners say at the time? We can't do that. My business model doesn't work this way. I'll go bankrupt. That's what businesses say today. We can't afford the higher minimum wage. We'll go bankrupt. My business model doesn't work. But what did society say at the time? It said, if your business model says it only works with slave labor, then you should be out of business. Somebody else will take your place and will make it work and will treat people with dignity. That's the kind of reset that we need to do today, because we're talking about minimum wage laws today that are forcing millions of people in poverty, in workplace conditions that are miserable, and they have no other option other than a zero wage if they're unemployed, right? We don't treat corn and cotton and wheat and coffee this way, but we treat people this way. So a job guarantee is a no-brainer. We do it in every other market. We need to do it in the labor market and treat people with dignity. And then we have millions of people who can actually contribute to the care economy, caring for people, caring for the planet, building communities from within. It's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I have two more questions. I was reading Dr. Ray on, I believe it was Greece, and I wanted to know your thoughts. I think he was saying something as Greece should return to their national sovereignty, and they could probably get out of their recession that they're having right now. I didn't know what your thoughts were on Greece, or if you would feel the same way about them returning back to their sovereign currency.
Yeah, I'm not sure when that comment was made. Probably in the beginning of the crisis. I think I read Randy say that. So if you're a member of the Eurozone, like Greece or Spain or Italy, you have two choices, stay within the Eurozone and accept the austerity plans from the Troika, from the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF, which means lots of social unrest, lots of misery for your people, or immediately leave the Eurozone and then suffer the consequences of retaliation from the European countries, because the rules of the Eurozone are almost like a collective suicide pact. Like it's like Hotel California. You can get in and never get out. So there's serious consequences, painful consequences for leaving immediately, because it's not going to be orderly. Mm-hmm. But in the long term, if you muddle through the transition out of the Eurozone, you're actually better off on your own. But once again, you have to have a vision, a purpose for it. It's not because you're angry, you want to leave, and then you don't know what to do, right? You don't know how to build a resilient economy from within. So I was not in favor of telling Greece leave if they didn't have a clear vision for how to actually build a resilient economy long-term on their own. Because that was often not part of the conversation. It was like an immediate crisis. We're gonna call their bluff. I'm gonna say, you either help us or we're going to leave. The third option, which is more orderly option, is for the ECB to come to their senses and to realize that they are the de facto sovereign entity of monetary sovereignty in the Eurozone, and that it's their responsibility to actually manage these crises. And managing these crises means you actually step up and allow countries like Greece, like Spain, to restructure their economy, to strengthen their economic policies and so on during the crisis. But of course, the ECB was not, to this point, is still obsessed with the principles of austerity. I mean, imagine the equivalent of this in the US, where one state in the US, say Ohio or California, is going through a crisis because of some major natural disaster or something like that. And then the federal government decides, you know what? They need to figure out on their own. They need to tighten their financial belts. They need to raise taxes. They need to borrow from financial markets and fix it on their own. We're not going to help from DC. That's effectively what the European Eurozone leadership is saying. You're on your own. You're irresponsible. Go fix it. Don't come begging for help.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have one more question, then somebody can ask one. I know, like, the huge, like, I know, like, a lot of leftists, communists, socialists have a huge issue with the Nordic models and trying to, like, pinpoint that as a social democracy. But, like, I know MMTers and PKs don't really look at those necessarily as social democracies. And I know, I can't remember which country it was who really didn't start doing this imperialistic tactic till, I believe, after World War II. I wanted to know your thoughts. I think it was Dr. Ray, again, who pretty much said that if we abolish the corporate tax rate and the payroll tax rate, that imperialism would somewhat fade away during the, I guess, over time. I don't know what your thoughts were on, like, imperialism or anything.
I'm actually not sure what he was referring to.
Okay.
So I'm afraid I can't really jump into this and say something that doesn't make any sense.
Oh, okay, my bad.
Yeah. But I'm happy to answer any other question.
Yeah, so it actually fits in pretty nicely with what we were talking about, the buffer stocks, because when you were talking earlier about how a lot of these issues with these developing countries is they need to import a lot of these food and raw materials. And we also couple that with the fact that developing nations are usually a lot more susceptible to higher inflationary expectations. This reminds me of a paper I read a while ago by Kaldor about, it was about an analysis of the stagflation that occurred in the 1970s. But as a solution, he proposed a sort of international system of commodity buffer stocks, which would include like commodities such as foodstuffs, fibers, metals, basic things, which would allow for, I guess, stabilizing inflation. I know it's kind of like an old and antiquated idea, but do you think such a proposal still holds merit and could be implemented, or what are your thoughts on that?
Very good question. Yeah, the Kaldor, international buffer stock system for commodities was really, I think, trying to build off of the observation that these buffer stock price stabilization mechanisms do work, and they still work for every commodity that we try it for. So why not generalize it and make it global? So in principle, I agree with the concept, but in terms of its practicality and coordination, I think we have better ways of doing this. Except it's going to face the same challenges, political challenges that an international commodity buffer stock system would challenge, because it requires coordination between countries, right, collectively. Keynes had a similar plan, but it was much more elegant and simple. Instead of having to coordinate all commodities, you actually coordinate only one thing, which is an international clearing union system. So what we face today, which Keynes anticipated, is that you're going to have a bunch of countries who have trade deficits and will constantly face weaker currency situation, and as a result will be forced into austerity policies. And Keynes wanted to create a global full employment type of economic arrangement. So the countries that accumulate trade surpluses will constantly have stronger currencies and stronger purchasing power and will accumulate more economic power. And the weaker countries, like developing countries, obviously, will constantly face this downward pressure on the exchange rate, which means they're going to have a lot of external debt, and there's no way they can pay it off, over time, collectively as a global South. So what Keynes proposed, he proposed introducing an international clearing union, the ICU, and this will be like the central bank for central banks at the international level. And it's going to create this new unit of account. He called it the bank core. It's not going to be a currency that you and I would use in the streets. It's not going to be available to anybody. It's just a unit of account for central banks to keep track of their balances. And the system would do the following. The system will say, if you have a trade surplus that you've accumulated, you can use it. You can use those, bank core units domestically to create full employment for your people, to develop your economy even further. Or you can use it to import stuff from other countries. So you create jobs in their economy and help their economic system. Or you can even grant it as a gift to another nation that's had either a war or a natural disaster or whatever. So you have 3 years to use it or lose it, essentially. When you lose it, it goes into this big pot that this international institution would allocate to countries who actually need those financial resources. So trade deficit countries who wouldn't have those resources, to help them create full employment and further develop without having to go into debt, right? The problem is, at the time, 1945, when Keynes proposed this, it was very clear that the biggest exporter post-World War II was going to be the US. And the US didn't want an international institution to take all of its trade surplus revenues and hand it out to some random country. Who knows, maybe it's an enemy, maybe it's a Soviet ally or something like that. So the US objected to it, which means we didn't have it. We ended up just with the World Bank and the IMF, but not with this system. So there's always going to be political opposition to it. My proposal today for a global Green New Deal is to recreate the Keynes proposal, but to put some kind of more urgency to it, to implement a global Green New Deal with reparations. And it's based on this following observation. That is, today, if you split the global North and global South and look at the data in terms of net financial flows, we find that the global South is sending $2 trillion a year to the global North. Net, right? There's no way we're going to save the planet or fix anything if the global North is constantly sucking money from the poorest countries on the planet. It's not new. It's been growing, actually, for the last 20, 30 years. It started at a few $100 billion, and then $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. Now it's $2 trillion. In 5 years, it's probably going to be 3 or 4 trillion. It keeps increasing. This is the system we have. So we have to reverse those flows. And the reversal of those flows has to be in the form of reparations, financial transfer of resources and technology, repairing the damage from colonialism, repairing the damage from climate damage, which is mostly the responsibility of the global North with the industrialization. So to reverse the flow, we create this automatic mechanism, let's call it the Keynes plan, where you transfer resources from the wealthiest countries to the poorest countries to help us accelerate the decarbonization and actual true reparations of the economic and financial system globally. And we can make the case for it because there's a truckload worth of evidence showing that countries in the global north are responsible for colonial atrocities, and we can go specific country by country and so on, corporation by corporation in some cases. And then in terms of the carbon footprint of the global north, you can easily track that and actually implement reparation programs for it. And we have to do it to save our lives. We can reject the proposal today and say, well, it doesn't work. The other good news is that we actually do have bits and pieces of this transfer of resources internationally, but it's very selective, and it's done by the US Fed in particular, the Federal Reserve Bank, and it's exclusive to countries that the US wants to support. It's called swap lines. Swap lines are these credit lines, essentially, that the Fed gives to major central banks and some, privileged central banks in order to help them stabilize their exchange rate during these crises, during the COVID crisis, during the 2008 financial crisis. So who does the Fed give this open-ended swap line, which would be the equivalent of the ICU, lender of last resort to other central banks? It gives it to the European Central Bank, to the Bank of Japan, to the Bank of Canada, to the Swiss bank, to the wealthiest countries and the most privileged countries economically. Well, the Fed can do the same for other countries too if they wanted to. But of course, we don't want the Fed to be in charge of the whole globe. We need to have an international clearing system. Exactly what Keynes proposed. So we know it works. We know these stabilization features do work. We know it from Kaldor. We know it from existing buffer stock commodity systems. We know it from the swap lines. We just need to leap forward and make this systematic and global.
Thank you for the answer. Yeah, I'd completely forgotten about Keynes' proposal, and we're definitely going to look into your proposal for the International Green New Deal as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wanted to just let NJ get a question in before, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, actually, I emailed another MMT professor, Dr. Harvey, or Professor Harvey, over at TCU, and we were discussing the neoclassical monopoly that exists when discussing economics. So how do you think that affects MMT proposals being actually implemented in the global south, considering that most of the economists and the policy people that are going to be able to implement these policies get their educations from like LSE, NYU, neoclassical schools? And if it does have an effect, how do we combat that neoclassical monopoly?
Very good question. That is really, critical. And we've been in this battle with mainstream economists and within the economics profession for decades. Post-Keynesians, institutionalists, Marxists. It's just the dominance is unbelievable. But there's been, with every dominant paradigm in economics and physics and any other field, there are these turning points, these paradigm shifts that do happen. And I highly recommend this book by, I'm blanking on the name, Thomas Kuhn, which is an old book from the 60s or 70s. He's a physicist by profession, but he's a philosopher of science. And he talks about the concept of paradigm shift in particular fields. The book is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Fantastic book. Probably the best book I've ever read in terms of like big ideas shifting the way we think about things. So he said, here's what happens. You have dominant paradigms that dominate universities and policy and influence in business and you name it, and endowments, and they dominate the whole system with their ideas. But then over time, they face these small puzzles that they can't fix, that they can't explain. So they assume them away. They say, oh, this is just an outlier. This little thing doesn't matter. And they can afford to do that. But over time, those puzzles, those anomalies keep accumulating and you can't ignore them anymore. And in economics right now, one of those anomalies that keeps accumulating is the fact that neoclassical economists can't really explain why is it that large deficits, large national debts are not actually causing inflation. Why is it that everything that the mainstream central banking theory said about inflation is actually backfiring? So those anomalies are now not small. It's not just Japan. It's not just the Eurozone. It's everywhere. They have no reliable way of explaining it. And MMT is stepping in and saying, oh, we have an answer to this. We know exactly what causes inflation and why. So what Thomas Kuhn was saying, when these anomalies accumulate, it's going to be younger graduate students who are going to come in and say, well, I'm not going to worry about the old theories. I'm going to figure out a new way to do it. They start playing around with these puzzles and come up with new solutions. And as they say, funeral by funeral, you see a paradigm shift. Those younger graduate students become professors and they start publishing, and there will be resistance, not just from within the profession, but from within the political system, because there's deep ideological commitments to everything we've been talking about today. So what the MMT community has done over the last 20 years or so is fight on multiple fronts. And we're way outnumbered by the other side on all fronts. Fight within the academic profession, publish the peer-reviewed academic work, but also fight in the public domain by engaging with the public. And with social media now, it's much easier to do this. There's no filter by the establishment. And then, fight on the media front, on the policy front, by challenging traditional views. And 20 years later, in the US, for example, now we have candidates who actually run for office and win with MMT-informed alternative perspectives. So we're not done. We haven't won yet, but increasingly we're gaining traction in the mainstream media, including financial media and the financial press. And it's going to take a critical mass to produce that turning point. So we haven't won yet. We're not there yet. But I wouldn't despair and say, well, they're too powerful, too strong, and there's no way we're going to break through this cycle. And that's one of the reasons I think what you guys are doing, what the Real Progressives are doing, what the MMT podcast is doing, what everybody's doing on social media is to bring this alternative perspective and let the public, let the younger students, let the academics actually engage in a fair and open debate about the validity of these ideas.
You were discussing the concept, as a quick follow-up, you were discussing the concept of like a critical mass and Kuhn's ideas of like these outliers. Would you say that in our global economy, you would require those outliers to lead to, say, like economic collapse of some sort, like a new 2008 to move us away from the neoclassicals? Like, be it the austerity measures in like Germany that can like ruin countries, and we just get into something terrible and emerge from it.
Yeah, there's this idea that many progressives have, that it takes a big disaster to produce a paradigm shift. Like the Great Depression produced Keynes, right, and Keynesian economics and the welfare state and all that. 2008 didn't really do that fully. It did bring Minsky, for example, to the public domain. It did bring the Occupy Wall Street movement, which delivered one major victory, which is putting inequality on the map, across the board. Nobody can ignore it anymore, and kind of fueled the Bernie movement, which fueled the AOC and the Cory Bush movement and all of those things. So those are important things, but did they change the economics profession? What did the economics profession do in 2008? They went radio silent for a while, and then they came back with a vengeance. As soon as you're out of the kind of the depth of the crisis, say, well, the market fixed it, and now we can tweak things around, but fundamentally everything is fine. And that MMT thing, it's voodoo economics, right? That's what the mainstream said. So I'm not so sure that we should be wishing for another disaster to get to get to that. I think it has to be done the hard way, the coherent and consistent way, which is keep mobilizing, keep organizing, keep educating the public and empowering people. Because I think what we're lacking is a coherent narrative for progressives across the US, across the world. And I'm hoping, that's what I believe in. I hope that some of the work that MMTers have been doing is really to provide this umbrella narrative that says there's a different way, an alternative to austerity, an alternative to mainstream economics. Because if you're a progressive politician running for office and with all the right things on your platform, you want health, you want education, you want all the right things, justice, and you name it. Ultimately, you're going to translate that into an economic plan. And when you do that, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to pay for it. So you're going to have to face that question with your constituents. And then you have two options. Option one is to say we're going to, tax and borrow and pay for it, which means you're going to face the usual criticism. Well, yeah, taxing is limited, borrowing is limited. The rich will never agree to pay that much. You're going to have to beg them to support your policies, and they're not going to let you through. Or you can go to the MMT lens that says, listen, we've done this before. We know how to do it. We're not constrained by tax revenues and borrowing capacity. You completely shift the narrative, and then your campaign is on fire because you can actually articulate why it's important. You're going to have to compromise, and you end up being yet another young Nancy Pelosi type pay-go candidate, which is not what motivates progressives to begin with.
That is something that is very true, and we've seen in our government for so long. So my question goes back to the topic of the job guarantee, and I had family back in India who were affected by this National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005, if you know what that is.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but obviously there have been so many different ways to tear at it, kind of. And
Right.
My question is, how do we ensure that when we implement a job guarantee, it's implemented in a way in the global south, in countries like India, that it can't be torn apart from some far-right leader who comes into power at a
Right.
point where I would say 15 years later.
Very good question. So for people who are not familiar with the NREGA program, which is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program in India, which is the largest public works program in the world, right? Millions of people are part of it. I wouldn't call it a job guarantee yet, because yes, it does guarantee employment for workers in rural areas for up to 100 days per year. So it's substantial, but it's not the job guarantee that Minsky talks about, that Randy Ray talks about, or Stephanie Kelton, which is the buffer stock mechanism. It's actually open-ended, decent wages and benefits and so on. One of the earlier things that I think helped strengthen the India's job guarantee program, or the NREGA program, was it was introduced, I think, right around the same time, or maybe right before that. There was a new law that was introduced to strengthen transparency, some kind of sunshine laws or something like that. I forget what it's called. And what it did, it empowered individuals who participate in the program to be able to have access to all kind of information about who's being hired, who's making the decision, who's getting paid, who's not getting paid, and immediately we're able to publicly report abuse in the system and corruption in the system. So that was used early on to, there are videos on YouTube saying, look, there's corruption in this program, we should cancel it. But that was the point. The point was to empower workers so that they actually pluck out those corrupt officials immediately as soon as there is interference with the integrity of the program. So laws like this allowed workers, participants in the program, to know what their rights are and to report abuse by corrupt officials and etc. So that is extremely important. Transparency and making sure that the system is implemented without abuse, without corruption, and so on. The other important thing is building a social movement around these programs, because these things are not meant to be introduced in a vacuum of public policy. I'll give you an example. When Argentina implemented its mini public works program that a lot of people refer to as the job guarantee in Argentina, in the early 2000s, it was called the Jefes program. It was a program that guaranteed employment for one person per household for a certain number of hours per week and so on. So it wasn't, again, living wage, full-time benefits and so on. It was a mini version of a job guarantee. One of the things that we discovered from that program, and there were surveys that were done by Pavlina Cherneva and Randy Ray and others. So the program went on in the midst of Argentina's Great Depression. One of the things that we observe is that when you survey the participants and you tell them, what do you like the most about the program? They start listing things. They say, I like the fact that I'm learning new skills, that this is a community-focused employment program, that we're actually helping the community, that the program includes services such as childcare, all kinds of things. And then finally, at the bottom of that list, 6 or 7 on the list, they say, oh, and we get paid too, right? So it wasn't the income that they cared about the most, it was all of these other benefits. So as the program was rolling, the community had full decision-making, kind of participatory, democratic way of deciding which projects they wanted to build in their community. So they set the priorities. We need a community garden, a community kitchen, a literacy program. They decided all of these things internally and got paid to build their own community from within. And then down the list came the next item, which is we need a health clinic in the community. Well, wait a minute, we can't be doctors and nurses. We don't have these skills. We can't train ourselves to become doctors. Wait a minute, this is the responsibility of the Ministry of Health. Why don't they have a clinic for us here in this isolated part of the country? So they decided to organize and protest the Ministry of Health and politicians on the right and on the left to demand health services in their own community. Why are we excluded in our own country? So they became a political mass that's actually a threat to the right-wing and left-wing parties in Argentina equally, right? Because they were demanding what a citizen should demand. So guess what? Politicians didn't like that. So they decided to, get rid of this protest movement of these organizers who were actually asking for democracy to be honored and protected. And they decided, you know what, this job guarantee thing, we started it during the crisis. We don't need it anymore. If those people need money, we'll just send them a welfare check. Send them money, stay home, be quiet, do nothing. Right? And that's exactly what they did. They transitioned away from a job guarantee to a welfare check, which from the original surveys, they didn't care for the check. They cared about all the other things that came with the employment opportunity. So when we talk about job guarantee programs, don't think of them as just this mechanical buffer stock thing. We're dealing with people, we're dealing with social needs, economic needs, ecological needs, which means we have to create the ecosystem with the job guarantee program that actually leverages those opportunities to strengthen democracy, to restore justice and restore true participatory democracy. So to go back to your question, in India, does India have that? I don't think so. I haven't seen it, right? So it's been limited to guaranteeing the 100 days per year. It's, of course, I'm not going to say it's nothing. It's a huge step forward, but it needs to be strengthened. You need to move from 100 days to the full year, and you need to move from just rural areas to an actual employment guarantee, even in urban areas. And then you have to build the working class consciousness around it. And the government is not going to do that for you, right? The business elite is not going to do that. The universities are not going to do that. This goes back to old-fashioned community organizing, labor organizing, which is the real threat to the forces that suffocate the economy, that suffocate democracy.
Let's get a couple more questions, and then if anyone in the chat wants to ask something, I'll go highlight the question. This has been a great conversation so far, and I just want to say before we move on, I want to thank everyone for putting this together. I think John left a little bit ago, and John helped put this together at Real Progressives. They've done an amazing job with everything they do. So their Twitter and everything's in the chat and in the description. Also, Dr. Kaboub's social media is also in the description, so please go follow him. So go ahead. I think Jasper was going to talk, and then Gannon.
It was
Nick.
so
Nick. Go ahead.
picked up from the comments early where someone asked if Western countries will disrupt former colonial countries' efforts. What would be the top priority, like type laws that like you'd recommend to like at least stop them from like imposing on these countries, trying to like develop like MMT like policy?
The sound was breaking up a little bit, so I'm sorry I didn't hear the question very well.
So
At the
pretty
beginning.
so pretty much the person was talking about how Western countries are like being involved in like these global South countries and like interfering with them from getting like a true progress. So like how would you prevent that, like for the countries to become like more sustainable? Like what would you recommend to like prevent like I guess imperialism from the global north?
Very good question. I think I'll go back to my earlier comment, which is, that internally, if you don't have well-informed citizenry that has a vision for the country, for itself, then it's always going to be manipulated from the outside, and it's going to be part of somebody else's vision. If you have corrupt officials who are serving the interest of the elite or the interest of foreign nations, then that's why it's very important to start with a solid foundation of true participatory democracy. When you have that level of resilience in your political system, you can build from it by making the right decisions on the economic front, on the agricultural front, on the international partnership front. But if you have corruptions from within, then there isn't really much you can do. And I think the useful thing that MMT provides for individuals who are interested in how do you deal with corruption, I think the MMT focus on the risk of inflation and the forces that suffocate the economy, ties together corruption with economic outcomes and ties together the real obstacles that are behind this. Because otherwise you'll have people fighting corruption for the sake of, let's get rid of this corrupt politician so we can have, a younger, clean, non-corrupt politician. But if that new politician or political party still believes in the same forces that suffocate the system, then you haven't done much, right? You've just replaced the old government with a new one that follows the same policies. I'll give you an example. I'm originally from Tunisia, and I've seen the outcome of the uprisings in 2010, 2011. Lots of hope, new constitution, more freedom of speech and everything. Great achievements, right? Everything was great, except every single government, every single political party that was part of the government or was in charge of the government had the exact same economic plan as the dictatorship regime. They wanted more foreign direct investment, more exports, more tourism, the same thing. The same forces that created that trap that I described earlier was actually reproduced after the uprisings and the transition to democracy, which led to the exact same outcomes: more inequality, more poverty, more unemployment, more youth frustration with the outcome, which was extremely dangerous, because now you have all the hopes and dreams of the young generation that brought the revolution into existence. All of it is destroyed, to the point that some people gave up on democracy. Some people even managed to utter the words that we were better off under dictatorship, because at least we had bread, at least we had some jobs, at least there was this, that, and the other. Yeah, we didn't have freedom, we were oppressed, but at least we didn't have this misery. And that's the most dangerous thing. That's the most devastating thing to come out of a mass youth movement yearning for democracy and justice and dignity and freedom. And it's precisely because the political parties completely reproduced the same economic model, and because the social forces that actually brought the transition to democracy, they had a vision, a clear vision about a constitution, about justice, about freedom of the press and everything, but they didn't have a vision for an economic plan. They just thought if we have non-corrupt leaders in the parliament, we'll have a better economic outcome. It's just we have non-corrupt leaders with the exact same neoclassical economic model that created the oligarchy in Tunisia, and then we get the same results. That's why it's so important to have a clear vision, not just for the president and the prime minister, but it has to be a clear vision as a national paradigm for the future of the country. And I think if we achieve that through public education, engagement with the media, with the public, with youth across the world, then we have a whole other vision for what is possible. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels left and right, and we're really not going anywhere.
Thank you.
Mr. Kaboub, my question is really quick. What I've been noticing in this contemporary form of capitalism is this lack of communalization of work and labor, and people and communities being turned into competitive mindsets. And what I've been reading a lot of Mrs. Polina Cherneva's opinions on what an employer of last resort can do for community labor and taking care of communal needs and whatnot, and really being focused towards what communities want to do with work and labor and whatnot. I was wondering if you believe like a jobs guarantee program can help communities get more of a more communal sense to work back.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that the job guarantee emphasizes and the MMT community emphasizes the importance of the care economy, caring for people, for the planet, for children, for the elderly, and so on, because these are the things that improve quality of life. These are the jobs that can't be outsourced or replaced by robots. I mean, we can still use, technology to improve the way we deliver healthcare, to improve the care the way we care for children, and so on. But at the end of the day, it's human touch. It's that interaction that raises the quality of the services and raises the quality of life. And those are actual needs that we have in the economy today. This is not like we have to wait for the need to arise. We have after-school programs that we're not investing in. We have summer camps that we're not doing. We have elder care that we're not attending to. And this is a huge reduction in our quality of life, and a huge employment opportunity that will rebuild that social fabric that's been dismantled over the last few decades. So absolutely, yeah, Pavlina's work is fantastic on that front.
I completely agree. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to go back a little bit to talk more about what these countries can themselves do to help better their development, we were talking about how a lot of these more like global systems like Keynes, Caldor's, and Global Green New Deal may hold a lot more political opposition, may not be as practical in getting, pushed as quickly into action. So I was wondering how these countries could control or fight against inflation with regards to the primary commodities that they import, such as food and energy and raw materials. Because I know Bill Mitchell has talked about food speculation, food price speculation.
Sure.
I want to elaborate on that a little bit. Like just in general, how can these countries themselves sort of avert this inflation fear?
Very good question. So I'm actually a little more optimistic on this front in terms of the potential for global collaboration sooner rather than later, and optimistic in a bad way, in a sense, because of the impending crisis that we're facing, that will be actually forced into collaboration sooner rather than later to save our lives. And I'm optimistic because I'm seeing signals from the global north that they're actually ready to take more serious action on the climate front internationally. So I'll give you an example. The European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank in the last 6 months joined NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System. And this network is a network of central banks and financial regulators globally who are trying to figure out what their role is in greening the financial system and fighting climate change. And the reason the Fed joined, I think, was not the IPCC report. It was actually the follow-up reports from investment banks and insurance companies, internal reports, who actually started to look into the financial risks that are currently on their books because of climate change. And one of those reports was published in The Guardian, I think, or at least the report content was leaked to The Guardian. And it talks about the IPCC report being actually very optimistic, that the situation is actually much, much worse. And this is from JP Morgan, I think. So what, sorry guys, I need to open the door to the baby because he wants to say hello. Okay, come join us, buddy. So, okay, say hello to the crowd. Okay. So, what the JP Morgan report is referring to are the massive financial risks that are on their books. I'll give you an example. Think of coastal properties across the U.S. It's estimated that coastal properties will lose about $1 trillion by 2045, which is the day after tomorrow when you think in these terms. So $1 trillion worth of hotels and resorts and real estate that will be flooded with the impact of climate change, right? And there's trillions more across the world. Think of all the stranded assets. Stranded assets are assets that are worth nothing, right, after climate change. All the flooded and destroyed properties, all the oil and gas infrastructure that will become obsolete as we transition to renewable energy. We're estimating $20 to $30 trillion worth of financial assets that will be stranded, meaning the biggest financial market crash in the history of the world. So that risk is on their books. He insists on playing music today. Can you give me the guitar, buddy? Thank you. Thank you. So those are the real risks that financial institutions are worried about. So what are they doing? They're urging governments, including the US government, European governments, to actually take action to mitigate these financial risks that they're going to face. So I'm optimistic in that sense, not because they're becoming tree huggers and they want to save the planet. They certainly want to save themselves and mitigate the massive risks that are sitting on their books. So if you're an insurance company, if you're an investment bank, all of these risks are already materializing. So with that action, I'm hoping that we will not let the Wall Street banks and insurance companies run our climate policy globally. What I'm saying is that they're finally paying attention. They're finally going to apply some pressure on governments to take action to serve their interest. This is our opportunity to have a clear vision for a global climate plan so that it's not the Wall Street climate plan. And that's what I've been doing lately, working on this global Green New Deal framework with reparations. So the fact that they are paying attention, that they're willing to take action and are asking governments to take action is a good step in the right direction. But again, if we let them decide what's going to be done globally, they're going to do it. So back to your question, what can countries in the global south do? Is have a clear, coherent vision for your country, for the global south, for the world as a whole, and then lobby and organize and mobilize to make it happen. So that's my idea here. And sorry about the background noise.
No, thank you so much, Fadhel. I see the little MMT in training right there.
Yes, he's my coworker.
Yeah. So something that you've mentioned a few times throughout the stream is reparations, and I'm wondering how do we go about implementing those, and how are they going to happen? Moreover,
so we look at the literature on reparations. There's three things that you have to keep in mind. One is telling the truth, right? So that's why I call for some sort of global network of truth and reconciliation commission that will actually allow people to, air their grievances and raise the issues on colonial, post-colonial, all kinds of abuses, right? Number two, after telling the truth, is offering a public apology, right? And then the third part is the actual reparations, which comes in two forms, for me at least. One is the actual transfer of financial resources to actually compensate for the harm that's been done. But even more important are the structural reparations, where you actually repair the broken structures that reproduce the effect of that abuse. For example, the global financial system, as I mentioned earlier, sucks $2 trillion from the global south as we speak. That's automatic. That's structural, right? We need to repair that broken structure so that it doesn't do that, right? So that's what I'm talking about. When we talk about the weaknesses that the global south has in terms of lack of food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and so on, reparations means you repair those weak systems so that you have a more resilient food supply chain locally and regionally, more resilient and clean energy supply domestically. So that's where the transfer of technology becomes part of reparations, right? Not just the monetary compensation, because we can do monetary compensation today and then allow the global financial system to suck it back up, after a few years with those $2 trillion that are moving back to the global north. That would not be effective, right? So to answer your question then with more detail, who's going to pay for what, right? Roughly speaking, we're talking about the global north and the global south. But the responsibility in the global north for carbon emissions is something that we can track. We have the data actually from the Industrial Revolution to this day. We know the carbon footprint of countries by emission, so we can price that. And we know the carbon footprint of the global north in terms of consumption, because a lot of the stuff that's produced in China and India is actually being consumed in the global north. So the actual carbon footprint of consumption is even heavier on the global north side. So we can price these things and set up a Keynes type of Bancor system where you transfer those resources over the next 10 years to help accelerate the transition. And then you have to supplement that with transfer of technology to actually build the resilience needed in developing countries. So that's roughly speaking what I'm talking about. There will be specific cases where, some colonial, companies that have, caused specific damage that we know, that's been reported, that's been documented, that's in the British archives, and the King Leopold's presence in Africa was not a walk in the park. We know that history, so we need direct compensation for atrocities that have been documented, from the beginning. Those are very specific, but the broad ones are kind of carbon emissions. We can price it, we can do it immediately. So that's kind of the framework, but then it's going to take a small army of lawyers and and accountants and economists and statisticians who will actually put this plan into action. I'm just providing the vision. I'm hoping to invite as many people to raise consciousness about the challenges and mobilize around a coherent policy solution that we can then turn into a concrete kind of piece by piece detailed plan.
Thank you so much. I actually appreciate that so much, because that's like in all of your presentations, whenever you mentioned that, I was always wondering what you meant by reparations, and now obviously I have a better understanding.
There's a lot more detail that you can't really write in a short op-ed or in a small very brief podcast. So I'm working on the details, and soon you'll see some more published pieces that will have a little bit more detail. Otherwise, if we talk about reparations open-ended, then what are we going to do? Go back 4,000 years and ask the Roman Empire to pay reparations? No, I'm talking about specifically repairing. And when I talk about reparations, it's for things that were done with an effect that's still present with us today, that we can trace it back to a particular set of events or countries or corporations, where we can say, this situation that we're in today dates back to this particular event, structural event that caused the follow-up damage. So we can trace things with precision, because you're going to have to do this in a sort of forensic way. Like in a court of law, you have to actually trace these things back. So a lot of it is easy to trace. That's why I mentioned carbon emissions. That's why I mentioned kind of colonial corporations, King Leopold. These things they're well documented. They're undeniable. And then there's additional stuff that we have to work on.
Awesome. I think we just have a couple, like one or two questions from the chat. And then,
Yeah, I think because he's setting up his podcast behind me here. So.
We have this one question saying, how can the global south attempt to rebuild a self-sustaining economy without interventions from capitalist nations or Western nations? Or that you would put the global north?
If I'm not mistaken, the way I'm reading this question is the same as a previous question. Oh, you put it in on the screen here. How can the global south attempt to rebuild a self-sustaining economy without facing intervention? Well, actually, you under the current system, you will face retaliations from the global north, especially if you're part of WTO agreements or free trade agreements. You can't really do any of these things. That's why part of this movement is really build a critical mass of developing countries who are actually able to do this en masse. But do it en masse, not just by saying, hey, we're out. We're not gonna. You have to have a vision. You have to have a plan to transition into doing it on your own. So I'll be the last one to advise. Go cancel your free trade agreements, and then we'll figure out a plan after that. So we're not talking about that kind of quick exit. What I will add here is that if you're worried about external resilience, external resistance from outside nations, as a developing country, you're actually in a very good position. In most cases, the internal opposition will be just as powerful, just as vicious. I'll tell you why. Here's an example. Most developing countries, because of their needs for key items like food and medicine and energy, they end up assigning import licenses, exclusive import licenses, to key players in the economy. Sometimes those are government agencies, sometimes they're private-public partnerships, sometimes they're just private businesses. And those individuals accumulate a massive amount of economic power because they're effectively a monopoly, and they can really control the supply chain for the economy, which means they can control prices, and they have a lot of political influence. So let's say we're talking about the importers of gasoline for the country, hypothetically. And then we say, we want to build a domestic renewable energy infrastructure, better public transportation. So we're going to reduce our imports of gasoline and fossil fuels to fuel the electricity company and all that. Well, what do you think that individual is how do they think they're going to feel about that? You're going to cut their market share. You're going to reduce their economic power and influence in the system and their political influence. So they're going to do whatever they can to fund an opposition party, to fund research that says, well, this is just a waste of money, it's inefficient. And that's the nice way to do it. I mean, in other cases, they actually go after you either in court or with fraud or with, in some cases, with violence, right? To oppose any alternative domestic economic development force that will displace their economic and political influence. So I would say, the internal opposition is sometimes much more, or if not just as challenging as the external pressure from other, global North countries.
Awesome. That's some awesome stuff. So this was amazing. We just hit around 2 hours. This was an amazing stream. And,
Thank you.
I appreciate getting, professional insight. A lot of people in this sphere get information from, kids on the app, and books. So it's really good to have, actually talking to someone who's a professional in this. And we really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And we also appreciate the panelists coming on and Real Progressives, as I said before, for organizing this, John, Roseanne. Please make sure to follow Fadhel. On Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube channel right here if you're here. And on our Instagram. Thank you guys so much for coming. This was an amazing experience, and we wish you the best, Fadhel, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, guys. Keep up the good work. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Fadhel. I really appreciate it, and thanks for being so easy to contact.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you also finally to Nick for putting this all together as well. Me and Nick have been thinking about this for the past week. We've been insane, psyched to do this, and we're happy it turned out really well. And with that, we're going to end the stream. Please consider subscribing. We're going to start streams up back again starting tomorrow. with more discussions with youth panelists. And have a good one, guys. See ya.
Thank you.